Welcome back to Digging Deeper Ag Chats with Al. As always, we're here to bring you practical advice from people who know the industry best. Joining us again for her monthly vet check-ins is Dr. Chelsea, a trusted large animal vet in our local area. Chelsea's got a wealth of experience working with sheep, beef and dairy, helping them stay on top of the herd and flock health. This week she's going to be tackling a big one and somewhat controversial, Pinkeye in cattle. It's a painful and costly disease that can hit livestock hard, especially in the summer months. Chelsea will walk us through the telltale signs, best treatment options, and some key strategies to help prevent an outbreak on your farm. So let's dig in. Welcome Chelsea, back by popular demand.
Thanks for having me again, Al.
It's good to have you back in the chair, and we're going to talk about Pinkeye today. But before we speak on Pinkeye, last we were talking, you had a young horse that you were a bit concerned about, and any developments of her since?
Unfortunately, there has been. It's not sort of been the outcome I've been hoping for, but I ended up taking her to a referral hospital called Southeast Equine in Narre Warren, and it's been a little bit frustrating actually. So
just a little bit backstory maybe first on the horse. Yep.
She's just not been feeling quite right. So that's a very obviously vague problem to have with a horse, but she's just I'd take her to one show and she'd feel really good, and then you take her to another show and she just doesn't feel quite right. And then I actually took her to a show at Sale a couple of months ago, and I was trotting her around in the practice ring and she actually fell over, which is very sort of out of character for her. So I stopped riding her and took her to this referral hospital to see what's going on. And unfortunately, still not much closer to an answer. And I think it's an interesting one though, because what we ended up doing was I had a specialist surgeon take a look at her, and she's got a very persistent low-grade hind limb lameness that they detected using like a motion sensor type thing that you attach to the horse. So
right.
To the naked eye, you can sometimes see it, but the main way you can see it is with these motion detector.
Something that actually straps onto different parts of the horse.
There's one that goes on the pole, one that goes on a front leg, and one that goes over their loins. So we ended up doing a series of nerve blocks to try and locate what part of her back end is causing pain, which was to no avail. And we did a series of 6 nerve blocks, and she was poked and prodded for quite a while, and she was so well behaved, which was really lovely, but also very frustrating at the same time, because unfortunately still no closer to an answer, and she's my best horse. And it's hard. It was probably a bit of a reminder of what members of the general public that I have to service on a daily basis have to deal with as well. It's a really hard decision to go, okay, well, the next step is, do I do a $3,000 bone scan in Werribee, or do I just give her 6 months off and see how she feels then? Or do I take her somewhere else for a second opinion? Do I get a physio to her? It's really hard sometimes to know what's best, even when you've got all the training behind you, to make an objective decision, especially when it's your own animal. So,
yeah, and she's a young horse too, is she?
She's 12, so she's middle-aged. She's not a sort of spring chicken anymore, but she's certainly not at an age where I think retirement's the next step either. So, yeah, that was a couple of weeks ago, and to be honest, I'm just trying not to make any major decisions too quickly. So she's just sitting in the paddock quite happily.
Yeah.
You know, she's not in pain as such. It's a poor performance type problem, so, you know, she's quite comfortable.
She's not putting it on, so she doesn't get rid of it?
No, I don't think so. And sometimes I take the other 2 horses to a show and she almost looks disappointed that she's not going. So, yeah, it's hard, like, when you've got these niggly sort of waxing and waning problems, not to sort of read too much into them when maybe they are just having a bad day. But also you don't want to dismiss the problem either. So, yeah, it was a good reminder for me on what, you know, my clients have to, you know, the decisions they have to make, because it's believe it or not, being a vet, it doesn't always make it easy to make the right decision either. So
yeah.
I'm sort of just honestly sitting on it at the moment and just sort of weighing up my options. So
we'll track that along next month when we come in. Hopefully we have some better news. It's an interesting thing that when you get called out for post-mortems, it's a similar story sometimes. You can't always figure out what the cause is sometimes.
Yeah, and even not just with postmortems, but just with vaguely sick animals as well. Cattle can be really difficult to diagnose, as everyone's sort of aware. They're very evolutionary selected to be quite a tough animal, so they will hide disease until it's very hard to treat and fix properly. Sometimes you can tell on a physical exam something's wrong, but it sometimes can be so vague that it's really hard to pinpoint. It's always easy for us as vets to say, oh, you should have called us 2 weeks ago and maybe we could have saved it, but sometimes 2 weeks ago, unless you've got a very, very experienced eye, it can be hard to even pick up that cow is sick. So,
Have you had much to do with the OptiWay systems?
I know a couple of our clients have got them, and I have been to some farm demos that, people have put them in, and they do seem like a really nifty piece of gear.
Yeah, not only for obviously weights, but I was talking to someone just the other day picking up worm burdens in cattle, which to look at the animal you wouldn't think it would be an issue, but because they're weighing them in the paddock every day, they go, well, these ones aren't performing, so we're going to do some tests and catching some of these things before visually we can see any negative impact.
It's interesting you say that, actually, because I do remember reading, I think it was on Worm Boss or Paraboss a few weeks ago when I was putting a presentation together, that, some strains of worm may not necessarily cause illness, but they will reduce voluntary feed intake. That correlates, and I can see how that would definitely be useful. So the dairy industry's got some interesting gear as well with the new collar systems that have gone in that can actually detect how much the cow's ruminating and their overall activities. With those newer sort of dairy setups that we're seeing, the cows will come in to be milked, and the drafting system will automatically draft them out at milking time if their rumination or their overall activity's been depressed over the previous 12 hours. So sometimes...
so is that with the GPS collars and mapping their walking speed, sitting down?
I don't know exactly how they work, but I do know that they can look at how much that cow's ruminated and walked around and things like that over the preceding 12 hours or so, and when that cow comes in they can have it set to certain settings so that the cow can be automatically drafted, whether that means a vet gets called out or the farmer can physically have a look at it and go, nah, maybe the computer's a bit off today, doesn't necessarily need to be actioned on, but to even just to be able to identify those cows and at least give them a closer look's really useful.
Useful if you're seeing your cattle twice a day as well.
Exactly.
All right, well, let's get into Pinkeye and cattle. So we talked last week, and this is something that has come up a little bit over the last little while, and there's quite a bit involved, and there's no, just like your horse situation, there's not always a clear-cut answer with Pinkeye. So what is Pinkeye? What's its causes, and how much or how does it manifest in animal?
Yeah, Pinkeye, I'll just start at the very beginning by saying that Pinkeye, despite being a fairly ancient disease as far as cattle illnesses go, is still quite poorly understood. Is
this by vets or producers or everyone?
Both. Yep. So there is some extra research that's been coming out over the last 12 months that I've done my best to try and sort of keep up with. But even the actual definition of what Pinkeye is can be a little bit controversial. So when I was a student at university, it was described from a pathological basis as keratoconjunctivitis. But even that has become a little bit controversial in what that actually means.
What does that actually mean?
So
for a
layman term, So for Pinkeye, it's a very non-specific ocular inflammation. So swelling and discoloration of the eye. But what we're sort of moving towards now is thinking of Pinkeye as sort of like an umbrella term for ocular disease in cattle. So when we say an umbrella term, it's sort of similar to when we say a horse has got colic. So when we think about colic in horses, it's a very non-specific abdominal pain that will cause the pawing and the kicking at the stomach and the rolling around and things like that. But when we've got a horse with colic, it could be because the gut's twisted on itself, or there's a physical blockage, or a piece of the gut has died, or there's worms. There's lots of different things that could cause that one clinical manifestation in an animal, and we think of Pinkeye in a very similar sort of sense now. So Pinkeye is very non-specifically, excessive tearing of the eye, a white or yellow or red sort of discoloration with pain and inflammation, photosensitivity, those sorts of things. But the exact cause of it, there could be many. So it's a very non-specific term.
Right. Is it a bacterial, viral?
And that's the thing, is it could be both.
Right.
So, and it could be one or the other. So there are some viruses that will cause Pinkeye type lesions. So there is an adenovirus and there is also herpes virus that can cause pinkeye. But there is also some bacteria that can cause pinkeye as well. So we've got the Moraxella bovis, Moraxella bovoculi. More recently, we're starting to see mycoplasma pop up as a cause. But sometimes it can also just be caused by resident bacteria that happen to live on the surface of the eye, and they have colonised an eye lesion for whatever reason, often opportunistically. So if there's some sort of physical damage to the eye because of a grass seed or, filarius, which can be quite pokey and painful if you poke your eye with it certain times a year, and also hay feeders and things like that could be causing some eye lesions as well.
So can we get pinkeye without those damage to the eye as well, or is it more susceptible once it is opened up?
And I know a lot of people sort of think of pinkeye this way as well. It's like when you think about a pie chart, there's usually several risk factors that go into the overall incidence of pinkeye and the outbreaks that we see. So sometimes there is just a different combination of risk factors that can lead to the pinkeye itself. So whether that's necessarily a poke in the eye from a physical abrasion, but also things like dust, excessive UV radiation. I'm just trying to think of some others, but it's not always the same set of risk factors, but we just know that there are a group of risk factors that do tend to lead to pinkeye.
Yep. So obviously at weaning time, there's often a fair bit of pinkeye going around, and there's multiple factors because they've been taken off mum, they've been put in often yards, hay feeders, cramped conditions sometimes, all those factors. That's
exactly right. So, and often we see weaning, particularly in this region, occurring during the summer to early autumn months when that's a higher risk period for dust and UV light levels as well. But exactly as you said, stress I think plays a major part in it, and just that whole process of weaning, which can lead to a reduced functionality of the immune system in general. And as you said, putting them into close confinement where there's lots of dust and commingling, and often when calves are weaned as well, there's usually some sort of hay feeder set up to put calves onto hay. So I often think that whether that hay is causing a lot of ocular injuries as well could be playing a role.
Yep. Now, is it contagious?
That's probably the part of the controversial issue we see with pinkeye, is that there are certainly some professionals that believe that it is contagious, and there are other veterinary professionals that are more thinking it's an environmental problem more so than a contagious problem. So that's a really difficult question.
Where are you on the fence, Chelsea?
Personally, I lean more towards it being an environmental condition from what I've read, and also, when I go out and see cases of pinkeye, a big part of what I do now is actually go and look at the environment that those cattle are in. Since seeing this research on the role of the environment in causing these outbreaks of pinkeye, it's now something that I consider part of a pinkeye investigation, is actually going out, not just in the yards and just looking at the cow's eyes, but actually going out into the paddock or the feedlot and looking at ways in which those calves and cows could have potentially sustained some sort of ocular injury. And I guess that's probably where my way of thinking has shifted a little bit, because one thing I do see a lot of is in bad outbreaks, calves that are on filarius paddocks where the filarius has gone to seed, and there is a lot of regions in the paddock where I think, there could have been a lot of ocular injury. And the other thing you'll see a lot of as well is hay feeders where calves are sticking literally their whole head inside the bale of hay. And since I've started approaching it from that perspective, it has sort of, I guess, changed my opinion of it a little bit. I certainly do appreciate that there are circumstances where pinkeye can behave in an infectious manner, but we, as a profession, we don't fully understand exactly how it spreads from animal to animal.
Yep. And when we're talking before on the phone, you said that eyes don't actually heal themselves well. So is this part of the problem?
Yeah, it's a part of treating eyes in all species from a veterinary perspective, is that it's really hard to get good antibiotic drug delivery onto the surface of an eye, just because of the pathophysiology of how blood penetrates the tear film and things like that. So obviously that means we need to often use topical medications, because if we use oral or injectable medications, we don't always necessarily see good drug penetration onto the surface of the eye. So it can be really tricky, irrespective of whether it's cattle, sheep or horses, to treat eye injuries. And I know just from personal experience, when I was milking cows for a living, I got sodium hypochlorite in my eye, and when I went to an eye specialist, I had to put drops in my eye every 2 hours. So I was getting up through the night, waking up, putting drops in my eyes and going back to sleep, because it's really hard to get good drug coverage for an extended period of time on the surface of the eye. And even, you know, in human medicine, where, you know, time and cost are not so much of a limiting factor, 2-hourly medication is still the baseline of treatment. So I think that says a lot about how hard eye injuries are to manage.
Yep. So let's talk about managing pinkeye then. Once we do have pinkeye in the herd, whether it be one or multiple animals, what is the general practice? I'm assuming it's going to change from situation to situation.
Yeah, that's right. And certainly I know some producers really try and avoid mustering animals because they are concerned that it could spread from animal to animal. And certainly anecdotally, you do hear of people where they start off with one or two and then they yard the whole mob, and then all of a sudden they've all got it. And I think we need to be careful, though, that we don't just instantly assume that, you know, a group of animals that have all been exposed to the same risk factors have necessarily got a contagious disease. If we're yarding the animals and there's lots of dust and flies and things like that, I often do wonder, you know, is it something that's actually spreading from animal to animal, or is it simply that we've exposed every animal in that mob simultaneously to the same pink eye causing risk factors, and that's what's caused an enormous number of cases, which we assume is contagious, but is it perhaps that we've simply exposed them all at the right time to the same risk factors? So whether the best thing to do is to yard the whole mob after one or two cases, it's a hard answer to come up with. But for the actual treatment and management of acute cases, in my experience, you know, putting patches on still remains a great way to manage the pain and the exposure to UV in clinically affected calves. The other thing I've started doing a little bit more recently, and again, this is probably following my own experience of having an eye ulcer, is pain relief. Having a chunk of your cornea missing is actually a really painful condition. So pain relief has been a mainstay of treatment for pink eye as well. I think the pain relief also helps to get calves back on feed a little bit quicker as well, because if they're standing there in pain all day, they're less likely to want to go up to a feeder or graze. And so I think that there's economic benefits in giving pain relief as well, because they're probably more likely to express normal grazing behaviour if they're not in pain. And to some extent, some sort of antibiotic treatment as well. And like I said last time, I'm definitely going to avoid giving specific advice on antibiotic administration on a podcast. But, have a chat to your vet would be my advice on what the best option is, because there are a few different options, whether that be injectable antibiotics or creams. There are a few different ways to treat pink eye, so it's always best to consult with your vet. But the other thing I'll probably say is I'm not a huge fan of the terramycin sprays either. They can be quite sort of irritant to the surface of the eye, so I'd always try and go for some sort of cream over a spray. Yeah,
it makes logical sense. If you're spraying something in the eye, the first thing you're going to try and do is rub it out, aren't you?
Exactly,
and that perpetuates the problem potentially. What happens if we don't treat pink eye?
The problem is that, particularly when there's an infectious on the surface of the eye, is that if we get what's called a really deep corneal ulcer that then starts to proliferate with the corneal layering separation, we can have a ruptured eye, which is not only a welfare problem, but if we have chronic eye inflammation that goes unchecked, because the eye shares some meninges with the brain, we can actually get meningitis as well. So if we don't treat it, we can end up getting calves with meningitis. So obviously that's a huge welfare issue as well, but also, you know, not ideal from an economic management standpoint as well, because once an animal gets meningitis, they're very, very difficult to cure. So early treatment is obviously preferable for that reason alone. So
Yep. Now, a lot of these treatments producers could do themselves, is that correct?
Yeah, look, certainly if we've got eyes that look like they're on the verge of rupturing, then certainly a vet needs to be consulted. But if you've got a good relationship with your vet, then there's no reason why producers can't treat a lot of these cases. But there does, because a lot of the medications that are required to treat Pinkeye are S4 medications. They will need some sort of relationship with a veterinary professional to be able to access those medications.
Yeah. What about impacts? Like you mentioned a little bit, if it gets really bad, but what about some of those subclinical sort of impacts on Pinkeye and mobs? What have you found affects the...
I think we will definitely see, as I probably mentioned before, a reduction in voluntary feed intake just because of the pain associated with Pinkeye, which can obviously impact your average daily gains and things like that as well. I can also see, particularly in cattle with both eyes affected, a lot of physical injury. Yeah, that's the word I was trying to find. Misadventure just from going through fences and ending up in drains and things like that. So there's obvious impacts there. But also at the other end of it, if they're left with a bit of scarring on their eyes, that can also impact what sort of market availability you've got as well. And I know certainly with export markets and things like that, they'll definitely come down quite heavily on anything that's got scarring on the eyes, and also in certain store markets and things like that. I've heard people have more trouble selling their stock if they've got scarring on their eyes as well.
Yeah. A lot of this talk is around young cattle. What about older cattle? Are they less susceptible?
Yeah, and it's a good point. It does tend to be certainly more of a young stock disease. We do very occasionally see adult cattle that do get it, but it's usually just the occasional one, whereas, you know, the large outbreaks that we see are more often in young stock. Another interesting observation that I read last year is when we sort of think about the risk factors with Pinkeye, you know, with the dust, UV radiation, hot days, things like that, you would expect that we would see a huge amount of Pinkeye in northern production systems, but recent surveying of producers has indicated that it's very much a southern farming issue. So for whatever reason, they're not seeing this in the Northern Territory in Queensland the way that we're seeing it in southern states, which when you think of it from a risk factor perspective doesn't make a lot of sense. But then when you think about the types of cattle that they have up there compared to down here, there's now the thought that maybe the way that we've selectively bred a lot of animals, the eye of a lot of southern Angus and Hereford cattle is a lot more exposed than your Bos Indicus breeds of cattle. So just that physical, more protruding eye structure versus a hooded eye structure is probably causing a bit of the problem as well.
Yeah. Are there any breeding values on...
Not to my knowledge at the moment, no. But whether that's something we could see in the future, certainly there's probably scope for it. Yep. In terms of how heritable it is, I honestly don't know. But that is something that there has been observations made that perhaps maybe in selectively breeding for some things, there's been, you know, more protruding ocular structure, which is potentially predisposing to Pinkeye. So
now, Pillygard, it's a vaccine available for Pinkeye, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So how does it work, and is there value in a program on it?
That's a question that's not easy to answer. And so the idea with Pillygard is that you give them the vaccine before the onset of the Pinkeye season, the Pinkeye season can be really hard to define in the first place. And it really depends on what type of bacteria you've got prevailing in your herd. So I've certainly spoken to producers that are quite adamant that they've used Pillygard in the past and it hasn't worked, but I've also spoken to producers that think it's been a game changer for them. So it's very unique to the farm, and I think what sort of strains of bugs you've got on your farm. One thing that we do occasionally do if we see the start of an outbreak is we will take swabs of Pinkeye cases to see what types of bugs are there, because sometimes that can help us to make a decision early in the outbreak of Pinkeye whether or not vaccinating the rest of the mob is going to be a worthwhile. And it's very specific to Moraxella bovis, and it says in the packet, I can't remember the exact figure, but it doesn't cover all the strains of Moraxella bovis either. It covers a proportion of them, and it says in the leaflet exactly what proportion. But Moraxella bovis is only one bacterial cause of pink eye. And as I said before, there's lots of bacterial causes, but there's also viruses and other causes as well. So it's one part of the puzzle. And what I would say is, you probably need to establish whether Moraxella bovis is a problem in your herd or not before going down the path of vaccinating.
Yep. So it's quite a complex little vaccine to see whether it's going to be worthwhile. And again, talking to your local vet is probably the first step before you actually go and buy packets of the stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So vaccines, one thing, but you talked a lot about environmental controls or controlling the environment. What sort of things are we actually trying to do to reduce pink eye through our environments?
Minimising any exposure to dusty conditions is the first thing. So trying to sort of plan ahead when you're doing your weaning management and things like that, so that we're minimising the number of yardings that we have to expose cattle to, and trying to sort of optimise the timing of treatment so that we're not doing unnecessary yardings through the high risk periods. The other thing that I think, and I know a lot of producers will argue this, that what's been a big game changer is really thinking about how we administer hay to young stock so that we're minimising ocular injury with that regard. One of the worst sort of feeding arrangements that we tend to see the most amount of pink eye with is those hay feeders where the calves are actually having to reach upwards to grab the hay from above their head. So the hay and the grass seeds and things are literally falling into their face as they're eating. Yep. That tends to be one of the biggest things that I'll try and advise people not to use. Whether we can look at feeding hay out on the ground so that they're putting their head over the top of them rather than in a ring feeder. I know sometimes that from a wastage perspective it's not the best, but anywhere where they're physically sticking their head into stalky substances is going to put them at risk of getting.
So it's a mixture of the dust and the sharpness of the stalk?
Correct. And also if there's grass seeds and things like that as well. Yep. I've done a lot of pink eye investigations where I've pulled grass seeds out behind third eyelids as well. And once there's a little hole in the surface of the cornea, the secondary bacterial infection just takes over. And so it might start with a very minor injury, but because of the way cows' inflammatory systems work, it can go from being a small injury to, those horrible, yellow looking eyes that have got pus pouring out of them very, very quickly. Enough
talk about pus, please. I'm not good with pus, but what about silage then? Does that reduce those physical things a
little bit? Being a more sort of wetter substance, it can reduce the likelihood a little bit. We can occasionally get grass seeds and things still in it, but I would consider it a slightly lower risk feed compared to your cereal hays and things like that, for sure.
And you said that shade, is that something that helps once pink eye is around, or does the actual UV contribute, you think?
There is some evidence that UV radiation can be a risk factor on its own, but also as a treatment as well, because they're going to be quite photophobic. So, because their eyes are going to be very light sensitive, having shade so that they're not standing in the hot sun where they're squinting all day is just going to provide them with a lot more comfort as well. Yeah.
So that's more so once they've
got pink.
Very good. Now, we had Trevor Caithness, who's the CEO at Gippsland Ag here last week. And he made the comment that his whole topic was on balancing your minerals in your soil. And he made the comment that a lot of these diseases, like pink eye, will sort of dissipate or disappear out of your mobs if you balance your soils. Where do you sit with that? Have you got any research to back up his claims?
I would definitely agree that, as a general observation, healthy, well-fed animals that have got good trace element management do definitely tend to be a lower risk for pink eye than animals that have got poorer quality feed available to them, have been through stressful conditions and may not be optimally managed with trace elements as well. So yeah, I'd absolutely agree. And we've certainly seen cases of pink eye which we think have been related to copper deficiency, and there is a link in the literature between copper deficiency and outbreaks of pink eye. The other thing that we have seen, and this is more anecdotal, is that because we're a region that's very poor with regards to selenium, anecdotally we've seen cases where selenium deficiency has likely contributed in some manner to a pink eye outbreak as well. I absolutely agree. I think that if you do a lot of things to just manage the overall health of the animal, your likelihood of getting major pink eye problems is definitely reduced. And we can certainly manage a lot of these trace element issues with soil health is part of management for some farms.
What about injectables today?
Yeah, you can definitely do those as well. Unfortunately, and it might change in the future, but Copernate, which is the main long-acting injection we have for copper, has actually gone off the market recently. Oh. There's also the long-acting injection for selenium, which is called Celavin, and there's also a lot of shorter-acting ones on the market as well. The other thing you can do, which is quite useful but just very labour-intensive, is the rumen boluses as well. So that's where you put a block down into the rumen and it sits in the reticulum of the cow and causes a slow release of those trace elements over a 12-month period. And there's a few of those on the market as well. So again, consult with your vet, because I won't make sweeping recommendations, but there are lots of different ways to get those products into your animals.
Yep, and just to make mention, two things. We're in Gippsland, so we're low in selenium in this area, but might not be the case for wherever you're listening. And the other thing that's important to note is that a lot of these drenches and vaccines now have traces in them, and so we've got to be careful that we're not doubling or tripling up on some of the...
That's exactly right, and I've also had to attend cases where animals have been overdosed as well. So the corollary with trace elements is that they are required in trace amounts, and when we give too much, it can be very, very harmful. Yeah. So it's definitely, as I said, advisable just to check with your local vet with what's going to be best for you and what's best for your farm, because particularly with regards to copper, we can see copper deficiencies because of things, as Trevor would have mentioned, that are playing out in the soil. So if you've got lots of moly or iron, for example, that could be competitively inhibiting your copper absorption. So even within one particular region, depending on what sort of soil type you've got on your farm, the recommendations will change from farm to farm based on that as well.
Yeah, so here at the research farm, we did a hair test on some sheep. Is that one of the best ways to see what we're lacking?
It's not always ideal. Sometimes the hair test can be a little bit misleading. The best way to assess what's going on is usually a blood test or a liver biopsy with trace elements. The other thing you can do is a pasture tissue test.
Yeah.
So that can actually give you an idea of how much copper is in your pasture, but also what else is in the pasture that could be inhibiting copper absorption, like I said, your iron or your moly.
Yeah, because soil tests and tissue tests don't always correlate, do they? You might have high in one but low in the other.
And what the plant chooses to take up from the soil may be completely different to what is in the soil itself.
Yeah, one thing we haven't actually talked about is sheep, pink eye in sheep as well, just not as common?
It's certainly not as common as in cattle, and usually caused by mycoplasma more so than the other types of causes that we see in cattle. Again, mycoplasma is not a super well understood bug, but again, it's usually associated with animals that have got some other sort of comorbidity. So with sheep, we think about worms, trace elements, poor nutrition, things like that could potentially lead to susceptibility to other conditions as well.
Yeah, we had it in our mob once, and I was mustering on sunlight, and a sheep ran straight into the middle of a gum tree, the only gum tree on the paddock. I knew there was a problem then, but from memory, we didn't do a whole lot to treat them, actually. They sort of recovered on their own.
Yeah, sometimes these ocular changes will just run their course, but I'm certainly hesitant to say, just don't do anything about it at the same time. But, sometimes I think these conditions can just run through stages, and I do sometimes wonder how much we're having as a role of actually medicating these conditions, would they get better on their own? And I think the answer is yes, sometimes they do just get better on their own, but as a vet, I'd always advocate for treating regardless. So.
Anything else you want to mention about pink eye before we wrap up?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well, to be honest. I think probably the biggest thing that I've learned over the last 12 months is that a lot of what we know about pink eye is just based on a lot of assumptions, and as we learn more and more, those assumptions are not necessarily correct. The other bit of information actually is the role of flies and whether flies can transmit it from animal to animal. And certainly when I was at university we're taught that the Moraxella bovis is transmitted from cow via the flies, but then when you actually look at research, it was pointed out last year that there's never actually been an Australian study to even investigate whether Australian flies can carry Moraxella bovis or not, and that's actually based on assumptions from overseas disease modelling and disease tracking. So I think the moral of the story is we probably still need a lot more research, and I know that MLA are putting some more funding into research into this space going forward, because we still have a lot of questions, and I'm always a bit dubious when people say, oh, I know what Pinkeye is, it's just caused by this and you just need to do this. But I don't certainly think that's the case. I think it's very property specific, and getting it back to basics, like I said, I think Pinkeye is probably a lot more complex than we realise, and we just assume all Pinkeye is the same, when in realistic terms I don't think it is at all.
Yep. Well, I think there's more questions and answers from this podcast, but it's good to be open and transparent, and you've been a fan favourite on the social so far, Chels, so you'll be around for a while, and when you're back you'll have some more info on Pinkeye. But our signature question, what is something you've learnt recently that did surprise you?
One thing that I did find quite surprising when we had Enoch here from the beef conference, and you know, there's a lot of controversy obviously at the moment in the media with cattle producing methane, but one thing I didn't know when he showed us that graph in his presentation, one of the really big pollutants of methane is rice paddies, which I did not know until he pointed that out, and it wasn't something that I knew was even a byproduct of rice farming in Southeast Asia. So, and then he went on to say that in more domestic production of rice, it doesn't seem to be so much of a problem because of different farming practices here. But yeah,
the anaerobic decomposition of the rice stalks in those areas, it's nothing I'd thought about. And also just in cereal crops in Australia as well, a lot of the stalks decompose and put off a bit of methane.
Yeah.
As they volatilise. So
it's just, I guess, one of those things where if you weren't measuring it, you just wouldn't even think about it. So.
Yep, that's a nice one. My son won't enjoy that fact as much as your last echidna one, but
I'll try and think of an animal fact for next time then.
Very good. Oh, thanks very much, Chelsea, for coming in.
No worries.
We'll see you next month.
Thanks, Al.
A big thank you for tuning in today. And remember, if you have a question about today's episode or a topic you'd like us to cover, reach out to one of our many platforms and join the conversation. We're here because of your passion and commitment to agriculture. Together, we can build a stronger farming future. This episode was brought to you by Herd Solutions, your local farm animal vets, servicing Mafra to Malakuta.
This podcast is made possible by the Future Drought Fund Regional Drought Resilience Planning Program, co-funded by the Victorian and Australian governments.